This 1892 family portrait looks peaceful, until you see what the youngest daughter is holding. The basement of the Charleston Historical Society smelled of old paper and dust, a scent Maya Richardson had grown to love over her 5 years as a digital archivist. September sunlight filtered weakly through high windows, casting long shadows across rows of filing cabinets holding fragments of forgotten lives. Maya reached for another photograph from the box labeled Estate Sale, Whitmore Collection, 1890s. Most images were typical, stiff portraits of white families, plantation houses, civic events, but this one stopped her cold. The sepia-toned image showed 6 people in a formal studio portrait, an African-American family impeccably dressed despite obvious modest means. The backdrop was painted to resemble a formal parlor. Maya's pulse quickened. Photographs of black families from this era were extraordinarily rare. Most families couldn't afford them, and many photographers refused black clients altogether. She placed the photograph on the scanner bed. When the image appeared on screen, Maya zoomed in slowly, examining each face. The father stood left, hand resting protectively on his oldest son's shoulder. His face was dignified, almost defiant. The mother stood right, wearing a high-necked dark dress with a simple brooch. 3 teenage boys were positioned behind their parents, wearing matching dark suits. The little girl seated front center held Maya's attention. She appeared about 6 years old, with large eyes and delicate features. She wore a white lace dress with dark ribbon, hair styled in neat braids. Her hands rested in her lap, holding something small. Maya zoomed closer, adjusting contrast and brightness. Her breath caught. The child held a folded piece of paper, carefully positioned in her small hands. At this resolution, Maya could see official printing on one edge, what appeared to be an embossed seal. She applied enhancement filters, revealing more detail. The document's edge showed partial words, State of South, and Certificate of... Maya flipped the photograph over. On the back, in faded pencil, the Carter family, Charleston, May 1892, before departure. Before departure. They were leaving. Maya returned to her screen, staring at the girl's face. The child's skin tone was noticeably lighter than the rest of the family. In sepia tones, the difference was subtle but unmistakable. Maya's heart pounded. In 1892, Charleston, a light-skinned black child in a darker-skinned family holding an official document, photographed before departure. This wasn't just a family portrait. This was evidence. Protection. But protection from what? She pulled her notebook closer and began writing questions. Who were the Carters? Why did they need this photograph? What was the document? And where did they go after this picture was taken? She didn't know yet she was about to uncover a story hidden for 132 years. Maya arrived before dawn, coffee in hand and determination burning. She'd barely slept, mind spinning with questions about the Carter family. Her first lead, the photographer's mark, Blackwell & Sons Photography. If they'd kept records, there might be information about the portrait. She spent the morning in city archives, searching business directories from the 1890s. Finally, Blackwell & Sons Photography, 127 King Street, established 1878. When Blackwell's studio closed in 1923, its business records were donated to the South Carolina Historical Society. By noon, Maya sat in a climate-controlled room with 3 leather-bound ledgers. Hands trembling, she opened the one marked 1892. Entries were meticulous: dates, client names, portrait types, payments. Maya flipped through until reaching May. May 14th, 1892. Carter family portrait. 6 persons. Payment in full, cash, rush order, completed same day. Client: Samuel Carter, Negro freedman, occupation tailor. Note: family departing city. Client requested extra prints. Rush order. Departing city. Extra prints. They needed multiple copies, probably for legal purposes. 3 days later, May 17th, 1892. Visit from Marshall Whitmore inquiring about Carter family portrait. Declined to provide information per client confidentiality. A marshal had come looking. Just 3 days after the photograph, Maya pulled up historical newspaper archives, searching Carter and Charleston in May 1892. Nothing relevant appeared. She searched Marshall Whitmore, Charleston, 1892. Harrison Whitmore was a private investigator specializing in retrieval services, tracking people who'd fled. But by 1892, slavery was abolished, so why hunt the Carters? Maya clicked a digitized court record from 1891. Whitmore appeared as witness in an estate dispute involving a deceased plantation owner named James Thornton. The relatives claimed Thornton had fathered a child with an enslaved woman, and that child had rights to the estate. The case had been dismissed in March 1892 due to insufficient evidence and missing parties. Missing parties, a mixed-race child, an estate worth thousands. Maya grabbed her phone and called her colleague Robert. I need you to search for any connection between James Thornton and a family named Carter in Charleston, 1880s to 1890s. This related to that photograph? Yes. I think that little girl might be Thornton's child. If the girl was Thornton's daughter, the relatives would view her as a threat to their inheritance, or as property they could control. Maya stared at the photograph. The document in the girl's hands was proof of identity, proof of custody, proof she belonged to the Carter family. The Carters had created visual evidence to protect a child from being stolen back, and then they'd run for their lives. Maya spent the next week buried in archives and court records. Robert had found the connection. A woman named Ruth, enslaved on the Thornton plantation until 1865, who had married Samuel Carter in 1867. But Ruth hadn't given birth to the light-skinned girl. That child's mother was someone else. The breakthrough came from a collection of letters donated by a descendant of a Charleston physician. In a letter dated January 1886, Dr. Henry Paulson wrote about a difficult birth. I was summoned to the Thornton estate for a young woman in labor. The circumstances were distressing. The girl, barely 17, had been assaulted by Thornton himself. She survived the birth but died 3 days later. The child, a girl with fair complexion, was taken by Ruth Carter. Thornton died the following week, never acknowledging the infant. I provided documentation as requested by Mrs. Carter. Maya read the letter 3 times, tears blurring her vision. The little girl, Grace, had been born from violence. Her mother had died, and Ruth and Samuel Carter had taken her in. When Thornton died, his estate was substantial. His distant relatives descended on Charleston to claim their inheritance. And then someone discovered Thornton had a child. Maya found the court filing from February 1891, petition for custody and estate rights, filed by Thornton Family Trust versus Carter family. The document argued that Grace should be removed from the Carter family. The stated reason was appropriate care and education. The real reason, control of the child, meant control of her inheritance. The Carters had fought back. Samuel scraped together money for a lawyer. Ruth testified about raising Grace from infancy, but the judge sided with the Thornton relatives. The preliminary ruling in March 1892 granted temporary custody to the trust, pending a final hearing in June. The Carters never appeared. By June, they were gone. Maya found Grace's birth certificate in the vital records, issued by Dr. Paulson in January 1886. Mother listed as Elizabeth, surname unknown, deceased. Father unknown. Legal guardians, Ruth and Samuel Carter. This was the document Grace held in the photograph, proof she'd been entrusted to the Carters from birth. Maya leaned back, overwhelmed. The Carters had known they would lose in court. They'd known the Thornton relatives would take Grace, control her life, possibly institutionalize her. So they'd commissioned multiple copies of a family portrait with Grace holding her birth certificate, created visual evidence of their family bond, and fled Charleston. But where had they gone, and had they survived? Maya's search led north to cities with established African-American communities that held refugees from racial violence. She started with passenger manifests from trains departing Charleston in May 1892. After 3 days, she found a notation in a railway conductor's logbook. May 15, 1892. Family of 6 Negroes paid cash for passage to Richmond. Excessive luggage, appeared nervous. Richmond was a waypoint. From there, lines ran to Philadelphia, Baltimore, New York. A librarian at the Philadelphia City Archives mentioned letters from Bethel AME Church, which had helped Southern black families resettle during the 1890s. Maya traveled to Philadelphia. The church's historical records were stored in a basement archive room. A volunteer archivist named Dorothy guided her to ledgers from the 1890s. We helped a lot of families back then, Dorothy explained. People fleeing violence, persecution. The church provided housing, helped men find work. Maya opened the ledger marked May-August 1892. On page 47, May 22, 1892, family from Charleston, Samuel C., tailor, age 39. Ruth C., laundress, age 36. 3 sons, Thomas, 16, James, 14, William, 12. 1 daughter, Grace, 6. Requested absolute confidentiality. Provided housing. Samuel employed at Taylor & Sons Tailoring. Maya's hands trembled. They'd made it. 7 days after leaving Charleston, the Carters had reached Philadelphia, but the entry included a note. Family reported being followed. Moved to secondary location after 2 weeks. Someone had tracked them. Dorothy flipped through pages. Here, June 10th, 1892. Carter family relocated to New York with assistance from Reverend Allen. Letters of introduction to Mother Zion Church in Harlem. Maya spent 2 days in New York working with church archives. The records confirmed the Carters' arrival mid-June 1892, but the trail grew cold. She searched census data, city directories. Nothing under Carter matched. Then she realized they'd changed their name. Maya studied the photograph again. What would they have chosen? She remembered Ruth had been described as someone who kept house for the Thornton family. She searched for porter, a service occupation suggesting dignity. The 1900 census for Manhattan listed Samuel Porter, age 47, Taylor, Ruth Porter, age 44, laundress, Thomas Porter, 24, James Porter, 22, William Porter, 20, and Grace Porter, age 14, daughter. The ages matched perfectly. The occupations matched. The Carters had become the Porters. They'd survived. Grace had grown up safe, surrounded by family, protected from those who'd wanted to use her. Maya's next breakthrough came from the New York Urban League archives. The League had conducted oral history interviews in the 1950s and early 1960s, documenting experiences of elderly black Americans. And Grace Porter had been interviewed. The recording was stored on a deteriorating reel-to-reel tape, digitized in 2003. Maya sat in the Schomburg Center listening room, headphones on, barely breathing as she pressed play. The voice was elderly but clear, with a slight southern accent softened by decades in New York. My name is Grace Porter, though that wasn't always my name. I was born in Charleston in 1886. My mother died when I was 3 days old, but I knew Ruth and Samuel Carter, who raised me, loved me, and sacrificed everything so I could live free. Maya's eyes filled with tears as Grace's story unfolded. She spoke about her early childhood in Charleston, living behind Samuel's tailor shop. She remembered her brother's laughter, Ruth's cooking, the feeling of safety. Then everything changed. I was 5 years old when the white people came to our door. They said I belonged to them, that I was part of their family. Ruth held me tight and told them to leave. After that, everything became frightening. There were lawyers, courts, men who looked at me like I was something they owned. Grace described the night they fled, the hurried packing, her brother's scared faces, the long train ride where everyone stayed silent and alert. She remembered the photograph session. Papa Samuel took us to a photographer before we left. He placed a paper in my hands and told me to hold it carefully. "This shows you belong to us," he said. "This shows you're our daughter. No one can take you away as long as we have this proof." Maya paused the recording, hands shaking. Grace had understood the photograph was protection. "Evidence," she resumed. Grace spoke about Philadelphia, then New York, about changing their name to Porter, about always being watchful. We lived quietly. Papa worked as a tailor, Mama took in laundry, my brothers found jobs, I went to school, something I would never have been allowed if the Thornton family had taken me. I became a teacher. Can you imagine? The child they wanted to lock away became someone who educated other children. I taught for 40 years in Harlem schools. Grace's tone shifted. In 1910, when I was 24, a private investigator found us. By then I was an adult, married. The courts couldn't touch me. But it terrified my parents. Grace continued. I confronted the investigator. I told him I knew who I was, and that I wanted nothing from the Thornton estate. I told him if he continued to harass my family, I would go to the newspapers with the whole story, how James Thornton had raped my mother, how his family tried to steal me. Maya smiled through tears. Grace had fought back. He left and never returned. I never wanted their blood money. Everything I valued came from Ruth and Samuel, my name, my education, my freedom. The recording ended. I still have that photograph from 1892. It's not just a picture, it's proof that love is stronger than law, that family is who chooses you. Every time I look at it, I see 6 people who refuse to let the world break them. Maya found Grace Porter's great-granddaughter through a genealogy website. Her name was Jasmine Williams, a 42-year-old high school history teacher in Brooklyn. The response came within hours. I've been waiting for someone to ask about her story. When can we meet? They met at a coffee shop in Fort Greene. Jasmine arrived carrying a worn leather portfolio, eyes bright with excitement. My great-grandmother Grace died when I was 5, Jasmine began. But my grandmother talked about her constantly. She said Grace was the strongest woman she'd ever known. Maya showed Jasmine the photograph from Charleston on her tablet. Jasmine stared, hand covering her mouth. That's her. That's Grace. She pointed to the little girl. I've seen another copy of this photograph. My grandmother kept it in a safe deposit box. Do you still have it? Jasmine nodded and opened the portfolio. Inside, protected by acid-free paper, was an identical photograph. Same pose, same family. But this copy had been treasured for 132 years. My grandmother gave this to me before she died. She told me it was the most important thing in our family, that it represented everything we came from. Maya explained everything she'd discovered. The Thornton estate, the custody battle, the flight north. Jasmine listened, occasionally wiping tears. Grace never talked about the Thornton family to her children, Jasmine said. She protected her kids from the painful parts. She wanted them to grow up without that burden. Did she talk about Ruth and Samuel Carter? Jasmine's face brightened. All the time. She called them Mama Ruth and Papa Samuel even when she was old. She said they gave her everything, not money or status, but dignity. Maya asked about the rest of the family. Jasmine pulled out a notebook with family history. Thomas became a Pullman porter. James became a carpenter, built homes in Harlem. William opened a barbershop that stayed in business until the 1970s. They all married, had children, lived long lives. And Samuel and Ruth? They lived to see their children settled and successful. Samuel died peacefully in 1919, surrounded by family. Ruth lived 3 more years. At her funeral, Grace stood up and told everyone that Ruth had saved her life twice. Once by taking her in as a baby, and once by loving her enough to risk everything. Jasmine paused, eyes on the photograph. Grace never claimed the Thornton inheritance. She said it was blood money. Everything she valued came from the Carters, her real family. "There's something else," Jasmine said quietly. She pulled out a small, folded document in a plastic sleeve. Grace's birth certificate from 1886, the same document visible in the photograph. Grace kept this her whole life. She showed it to my grandmother once and said, "This paper says Ruth and Samuel Carter are my legal guardians." But no paper could capture what they really were. They were my parents, my protectors, my heroes. Oh. Maya carefully examined the certificate. Dr. Paulson's signature was clear, the embossed seal intact. "What are you going to do with this research?" Jasmine asked. "I want to write about it," Maya said. "I want people to know what the Carter family did. This photograph is evidence of resistance, of love, of black families protecting their own." Jasmine nodded. Grace would want that. She spent her life teaching history. This story, her story, it's part of that legacy. Jasmine pulled out her phone. "This is my daughter, Kennedy. She's 8 years old." The little girl had Grace's eyes, that same direct gaze. I tell Kennedy stories about her great-great-great-grandmother, about how she was brave, how she survived. And I tell her about Ruth and Samuel, the people who chose love over law. While Maya's focus had been on the Carter family's survival, one piece remained unexplored. What happened to the Thornton estate and the relatives who'd pursued Grace so relentlessly? Back in Charleston, Maya returned to courthouse archives to trace the legal aftermath. The Thornton Family Trust had continued searching for Grace through 1893, hiring private investigators and filing missing persons reports. They'd pressured Charleston police to treat the Carters as fugitives. But by 1894, the Trust's resources were depleting. Legal fees and investigation costs were draining the estate rapidly. Without Grace under their control, the Trust couldn't access portions of the inheritance tied to direct descendants. A court filing from March 1895 showed the beginning of the end. The Thornton relatives had begun fighting among themselves. 3 factions claimed authority over the estate, each accusing others of mismanagement. By 1900, the estate was fractured and diminished. Property had been sold to pay legal fees. The family home was foreclosed and sold at auction. Maya found a newspaper article from 1902. "The Thornton Curse, How a Fortune Built on Cotton Crumbled into Dust." The reporter documented how the family's obsessive search for the illegitimate daughter had consumed resources, leading to neglect of actual estate management. The final court record, dated 1908, showed complete dissolution. The remaining assets were divided among squabbling relatives, each receiving far less than they would have with responsible management. Harrison Whitmore, the investigator who'd tracked the Carters to Philadelphia, appeared in one more document. A lawsuit against the Thornton Trust in 1894 for unpaid fees. He'd never found Grace, never earned his payment. Maya discovered something else, a sealed affidavit filed in 1910, the same year Grace mentioned being confronted by an investigator. It took 2 weeks to have it unsealed. When Maya read it, she understood why Grace's threat had worked. The affidavit was written by Dr. Henry Paulson. Now an old man, he decided to document the truth. His statement was damning. James Thornton had systematically abused young women in his household. Elizabeth, Grace's mother, had been 17 when Thornton assaulted her. Paulson wrote, "I can no longer remain silent about the crimes of James Thornton. His family's pursuit of his illegitimate daughter is motivated purely by greed. They seek to control her inheritance while denying her humanity. The child was taken by Ruth Carter, a woman of integrity. If the Thornton family continues their harassment, I will testify publicly to everything I witnessed." The affidavit was dated June 1910. Paulson had filed it as protection, as evidence that could be released if the Thorntons didn't back off. It had worked. No further legal actions were filed. Maya processed the complete picture. The Thornton relatives had destroyed their fortune chasing a child they saw as property. Their greed had blinded them. They'd lost everything, while Grace had built a life of purpose. The Thornton estate was dust and ashes, but Grace Porter's legacy lived on in her children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, in Jasmine and Kennedy, and all descendants who carried forward the strength of Ruth and Samuel Carter. 6 months after discovering the photograph, Maya stood in the Charleston Historical Society's main gallery, watching workers install her exhibition, The Carter Family, A Portrait of Courage, 1892-2024. The centerpiece was a large-scale reproduction of the family portrait, mounted with dramatic lighting. Beside it, under glass, was the original photograph Maya had found. Next to that, on loan from Jasmine Williams, was the family's copy, the one Grace had carried north. The exhibition told the complete story through documents, photographs, and audio recordings. Visitors could read Dr. Paulson's letters, examine the birth certificate reproduction, listen to excerpts from Grace's oral history, and trace the family's journey on a large map. Maya had included something else, a section documenting how custody battles continue to affect black families today, how the legacy of treating children as property persists in foster care systems and family courts. Jasmine had helped curate this section. Grace's story didn't end in 1892, Jasmine insisted. It's still happening. Black families are still fighting to stay together. The exhibition was scheduled to open on May 14th, 2025, exactly 133 years after the Carter family had posed for their portrait. The night before opening, Maya walked through the gallery alone, checking every detail. She stopped before the photograph, studying the faces she'd come to know. Samuel Carter, standing tall, hand on his son's shoulder, eyes defiant. Ruth Carter, elegant and strong. The three sons, ready to protect their family. And Grace, small but holding that document, her proof, her protection. "You made it," Maya whispered. "You all made it." Opening day arrived with perfect spring weather. By 10 a.m., a line had formed outside. Local news cameras were set up, reporters interviewing visitors. Maya watched people move through the exhibition, reading panels, examining documents, listening to Grace's recorded voice. She saw tears, heard gasps, observed people photographing displays to share. The most powerful moment came when Jasmine arrived with her family. Kennedy, wearing a white dress echoing Grace's outfit, walked slowly through the exhibition with her mother, grandmother, and relatives. They stopped before the portrait. Kennedy stared up at Grace's face, then reached out to touch the protective glass. "That's her," Kennedy said softly. "That's my grandmother, Grace." Jasmine knelt beside her daughter. "She was brave, just like you, and she was loved. Do you see how her family is standing close, protecting her?" Kennedy nodded. "They kept her safe." "Yes, and we keep her memory safe by telling her story, by remembering what the Carter family did." A crowd had gathered, listening quietly. Jasmine stood and addressed them. "My great-grandmother, Grace Porter, lived until 1964. She taught school for 40 years, raised 3 children, lived to see the Civil Rights Act passed. She never forgot Ruth and Samuel Carter. This photograph represents everything she valued: family, courage, love, and the refusal to let cruel people define who you are." Someone asked, "Did she ever regret not claiming the Thornton inheritance?" Jasmine smiled. "Never. She used to say, 'I inherited something far more valuable than money. I inherited dignity, freedom, and the knowledge that I was loved for who I was.' That's the inheritance she passed to us." Throughout the day, visitors shared their own stories of family separation and the fight to stay together. 8 months after the exhibition opened, Maya found herself in a New York studio, being interviewed for a PBS documentary about the Carter family. The producer, Angela, had been developing the project since seeing news coverage. "We want to tell this story in a way that honors the family while exploring the broader context," Angela explained. "What made the Carters' situation unique, and what made it representative?" The documentary team had conducted extensive research, finding additional photographs and documents. They'd also tracked down descendants of the Carter sons who'd never known about Grace's story. They'd even found descendants of the Thornton family. One, a woman named Patricia Thornton Hayes, had agreed to be interviewed. Maya watched Patricia's interview footage in the editing suite. The woman, in her 60s, spoke with visible discomfort. "I grew up hearing whispers about James Thornton, about how the family fortune was lost, about some scandal involving a child, but no one told me the full truth." Patricia's hands trembled. "Learning what he did, what my family tried to do to that little girl, it's shameful." The interviewer asked what Patricia thought now. "I think about how different things could have been if my family had done the right thing, if they'd supported the Carters instead of hunting them. But they chose greed. They destroyed everything: the estate, the family reputation, their humanity." She paused. "Meanwhile, Grace Porter became a teacher, raised a family, contributed to her community. She won. They lost, and that's exactly as it should be." The documentary included interviews with historians who contextualized the Carter family's experience. Dr. Marcus Webb explained how custody battles over mixed-race children were common in this era. White families often sought control of these children not out of affection, but to manage inheritance claims or maintain social control. Black families who protected these children took enormous risks. What the Carters did required tremendous courage. Dr. Sharon Mills discussed the role of photographs in black resistance. These portraits weren't just personal mementos, they were political statements. They said, "We are families, we are human, we exist with dignity." For the Carters to include that birth certificate was genius. It created legal and visual documentation. The documentary included recreations of key moments: the night they fled Charleston, the train ride north, their arrival at the Philadelphia church, Grace growing up in New York. The most powerful segment featured Kennedy Williams, now 9, visiting Charleston for the first time. The crew filmed Kennedy standing on King Street near where Blackwell's studio had operated. She held a reproduction of the 1892 photograph. "This is where they were before they had to run away," Kennedy said seriously. "They were scared, but they were brave. Grandmother Grace was only 6, like my little brother. I can't imagine having to leave everything." They visited the Historical Society. Kennedy stood before the original photograph for a long time, silent. "What are you thinking about?" Angela asked gently. "I'm thinking about how Grandmother Grace held that paper, and now I know what it meant. It meant she belonged to people who loved her. It meant she was safe." Kennedy looked at the camera. "And I'm thinking about how she kept that photograph her whole life, so we would know this story, so we wouldn't forget." The documentary concluded with Maya's narration. "This photograph has traveled 133 years, but its journey isn't over. Every time someone sees it, it continues to do what Samuel and Ruth intended. It testifies to love, resistance, and unbreakable family bonds." The final image showed Jasmine, Kennedy, and their extended family standing together before the exhibition, holding the reproduction of the 1892 portrait, a visual echo across generations. 2 years after Maya first discovered the photograph, she returned to Charleston for the Historical Society's symposium on family, identity, and resistance in the post-Reconstruction South. The Carter family's story had become a touchstone for understanding this era. But for Maya, the most meaningful impact was personal. She had received hundreds of letters from people who'd seen the exhibition or documentary sharing their own family stories. One letter particularly moved her. It came from a woman in Georgia who'd been searching for information about her great-grandmother, a light-skinned black woman who'd disappeared from family records in the 1890s. Inspired by Maya's research methods, the woman had found her ancestor's story. Another custody battle, another flight north. "Your work showed me these stories matter, that they're worth pursuing," the woman wrote. "You helped me find my great-grandmother. You helped me understand what my family survived." The symposium brought together historians, activists, descendants, and community members. Jasmine Williams gave a keynote address about translating historical trauma into contemporary action. Kennedy Williams, now 11, participated in a youth panel about learning family history. She spoke confidently about her great-great-great-grandmother, Grace. "When I first saw that old photograph, I just thought it was cool we had a picture from so long ago," Kennedy told the audience. "But now I understand it's not just a picture, it's proof. Proof that my family has always been strong, always fought for each other, always survived. When things are hard, I think about Grandmother Grace holding that paper, being brave even though she was scared. It helps me be brave too." During a break, Maya stood in the gallery where the exhibition was still displayed, now a permanent installation. A group of middle school students were visiting. One student, a black girl about Grace's age in the photograph, stared up at the portrait for a long time. Finally, she turned to her teacher. "They really loved her," the girl said. "You can see it in how they're all standing close, protecting her." "Yes," the teacher confirmed. "What do you think this photograph tells us about families?" The girl thought carefully. "That family isn't just about blood. It's about who chooses to love you and protect you, and that sometimes being a family means being really brave." Maya's eyes filled with tears. This was why the story mattered, not just as history, but as a living lesson. That evening, Maya gave the closing address. She spoke about the journey from that first moment in the archive to this gathering. The Carter family photograph could have remained forgotten, Maya told the audience. Grace could have been just another name in census records. But Samuel and Ruth Carter made sure that wouldn't happen. They created a document that would speak across generations. She paused, looking out at the faces. Descendants, scholars, activists, students. This story asks us to think about whose narratives we preserve. It asks us to consider how we document resistance, and it challenges us to recognize that the struggle the Carters faced to keep their family together continues today in different forms. Maya's final words were addressed to the Carter-Porter descendants. Your ancestors made a choice that reverberated through time. They chose love over law, courage over safety, family over everything. Because of their choice, Grace lived free. Because Grace lived free, she had children and grandchildren. You are their legacy. You are their victory. The standing ovation lasted several minutes. Late that night, Maya returned to the gallery one final time. She stood alone before the photograph, seeing it now not just as a historical document, but as a sacred object, evidence of love that had transcended law, time, and death. Somewhere in that photograph, frozen in time but alive in memory, 6 people stood together, proud, defiant, and unbreakable. Their story was no longer hidden. Their sacrifice was no longer forgotten.